I'm ready.
Has everyone voted? Okay, well, take it away. There's also a clicker if you want to use it. Fantastic. Oh, okay, sorry. I had introductions and everything. Sorry. Martin is a reformed accountant and DBA who enjoys beard grooming, video games, and prepping for the end of the world. Martin is a senior software developer at Gherkin who works on clients such as Hillary's Blinds and TrendSpan and Express, making sure they always run to time. You have 15 minutes.
I make no commitments on that. Hello everyone, I've looked at the tally. I'm fighting a losing battle already, so any support you can give me will be fantastic. As Mark says, I'm a senior developer over at Co Computer Love. And tonight, I'm going to try and convince everyone that Cucumber is the single best development tool in the world ever, bar none. That's going to be one of them evenings, isn't it? So I'm going to start with a little story. The story starts with Mr. Client. Mr. Client's a nightmare. No one can ever understand what he says. He speaks in riddles, he gives vague descriptions of things he may or may not want. He often speaks to project manager. Project manager speaks in project managerese. You know, she shouts a lot. She tells us different times when she wants things. Then we've got really shifty looking developers. Either shifty or hungover, I'm not sure there. But he speaks in code. A lot of outside developers can't understand him. You know, I think he's part machine myself, but. Then we've got QA. She's lovely. She speaks in, I want to break that thing you've worked really hard on. So she can be quite difficult to speak to at times. But then we hired this guy, Cucumber. He's amazing. He came in and he made everyone speak the same language. Everyone was able to speak to each other on the same level. Everyone understood what everyone else was speaking about. And everything was wonderful after that. So what is Cucumber? Cucumber is not just automated tests. If you come into it from that, you're missing a big part of what it's supposed to be about. Automated tests is part of it, and it's a great benefit you get out of it. But the specifications is a massive benefit that you get out of it. So in the Cucumber language, which I'll go on to shortly, it's a clear, understandable way which everyone can understand in plain English how software is supposed to behave. And out the back of that, because these specifications are automated and repeatable, you get a living documentation for free essentially. So if a requirement changes, you change the software, a test will break, you have to update your documentation. It's always up to date and always correct and always readable. So here's an example of Cucumber. So you start off with the feature, and the general point of the feature is that as I want to, so that. And this is a real good way of being clear of who wants this software, why is this piece of functionality being created, and what's the benefit for it? Why are we doing it in the first place? And I think the feature is often overlooked when people use Cucumber. Because that's not the directly testable, repeatable part, people tend to forget that. And I think that's a shame, because that's a big part of why we do this. After the feature, you've got your scenario, and that's the given when then, which I'm sure a lot of people, have people seen given when then before? Is that? Yep, fantastic. So this is basically your test part. This is your arrange, act, assert, essentially. So these are some of the benefits that fall out the back of using Cucumber. You get a single source of truth. Just like before, I was saying you've got your documentation, you've got your tests, your specification. It's this one thing that runs right the way through the product lifecycle. And that just makes it gets rid of ambiguity basically, and that's a real big benefit. As I said before, the living documentation, it's always up to date for one. I don't know if anybody's ever tried to write documentation just manually. It's not the most fun thing to do. Well, it's easy to read. I think that's probably key. So that takes it out of just the development team and puts it in the hands of anybody, the client, potential customers. What is this thing going to do? And everyone can understand it. Regression. It doesn't cause regression. That's probably not the best name for that slide. It avoids regression, I should say. But it avoids rework. So you've got these repeatable, automatable tests. And there's a lot of tooling around that. So dashboards, printable documentation. You can see straight off the bat if something's broken when you've added a new piece of functionality. And not only can you see that something's broken, what's broken, and was that initial requirement wrong, I guess? But this is the main thing for me for Cucumber. All that other stuff is brilliant, makes life a lot easier, but collaboration is what it comes down to for me. It's a conversation starter. It makes, going back to that story, it makes conversations between the client and even a dev who speaks in code possible and gets them talking. Should something behave like that? Really, really useful. So in our team, we do actually use Cucumber tests, and I think we've seen a lot of benefits from that. I think it's given us a common language. So going back to the story again, our estimation sessions have been a lot smoother these days. When we've got these vague requirements, we all work together, we all talk in a common language, and we all get the behaviour that we want a piece of software to have, and that's recorded. And then that can get picked up through the development lifecycle. Even if a developer wasn't involved in the initial discussions, they understand it, it's human readable. They don't need that experience of the initial requirements gathering to help. And also, I believe the QA has found a massive benefit through this common language that we use. It's clear. If something's working, it's working. You know, it's gone green. She can just tick off the list, basically. Over time, you can build up a library of tests for your Cucumber suite. So in SpecFlow, which is the implementation of Cucumber that we use, you've got this concept of feature files and step files, and that's sort of the bridge between the human readable language and your automated testing. So your feature file is essentially the Cucumber language. One thing that I think people can often make a bit of a mistake with SpecFlow in particular, but Cucumber, is the code versions of the features are a direct mirror of the human readable features. And I don't think that works very well. I think that sort of misses the point of that bridge. So in your code behind, your step files, if you build up a suite of reusable tests, the speed to adding new functions and features really, really gathers pace. And I think that comes onto the overhead. So I think a big argument against Cucumber automated testing and acceptance testing is, yeah, you do have to do a bit of work. It's not easy. You're probably going to get it wrong to start with. But, you know, there's people out there who thought unit testing was an unneeded overhead to start with. And we all know what happened to those people. This, in turn, has increased the confidence in the team. So, as a team, we're more happy to put new features in. We know, real critical stuff to the side. We'll put this new feature in, and our board's still green, everyone's happy. But also the client. The client has actually really surprised me since we've started using Cucumber. On a regular basis, they want to see what acceptance tests we've put in place. It's given them a real confidence to, yeah, they knew we did unit testing, they knew we did integration testing. That's sort of an abstract concept to them. But they can see, I'm on the site, I do this, then this happens. And that's really made them happy. But again, coming back to collaboration, with the theme running through here, if anyone's seen. The team has come together since using Cucumber. It's been really, really helpful for taking knowledge from tacit to explicit. I don't know if you guys have experienced this, but I've certainly experienced it in a lot of places I've worked where there's just a massive amount of knowledge sat within, say, a project manager or a business owner's head. Yeah, this should work like this because of this. And the developers just get, do this and I want to see that. You don't know why, you don't know how that should interact with something else. But putting something in Cucumber, it's just given everyone that level of understanding and knowledge, and it's been very helpful. So, quickly just jumping onto the technical side of it slightly. If anyone's not using Cucumber, hopefully there shouldn't be any real technical barriers to why you should be. It's massively supported. There's loads of implementations of it. This is just a handful of some of the languages that you can implement Cucumber in. So after this, I don't want to hear anybody saying I can't. As I said before, I'm mainly a .NET developer, so SpecFlow is the implementation that I'm used to using. Here's an example of a feature file, and the tooling within Visual Studio for SpecFlow is brilliant if no one's used it. It's really easy. Is someone laughed at It's really easy to use, a couple of NuGet packages, and this is what you can end up with in pretty short order. And even in your human readable feature files, you get IntelliSense. So I've actually been at places where developers don't actually write these, the QAs do. And it just brings everyone together to deliver these features. Here's an example of the code behind your step files. It's just a unit test. There's not much to say about this, to be honest. But one thing I do love about it is NUnit runs it. So you don't need to leave your IDE. If any developer's saying it's stopping their workflow, then they're doing it wrong, really. There's no reason why it can't just be part of your standard development process. So, in conclusion, have I proved to everyone that Cucumber is the best development tool in the world? Even I would probably say that. Come on, let's be honest. It's good, but it's not that good. But, just coming back to that collaboration point again, do you need Cucumber? No, you can get by without it. You can get automated tests. People are able to speak to people without Cucumber. But that's not easy. I'm not very good at speaking to people. I'm not good at understanding what a client wants. So if it just helps that in a little bit, I don't see there's any reason why you shouldn't be doing it. So I'm just going to finish on a bit of wider research I did for this presentation. And don't read too much into it, but apparently none of these guys think SpecFlow is a good idea. So I don't know if that's cause or correlation, but you know, it's out there. And that's me and Cucumber.
Keep talking.
That's it, just vamp for 2 minutes.
Kevin, would you like to put that? I'll give you
Give me a.
I was going to say I'll give you a 2-minute warning. There you.
Thank you.
Can you see that?
Yep.
The time begins now.
Thank you. So obviously I don't warrant an introduction.
Oh damn it! Sorry. Wait, let's go back one.
So I'm Kevin. I'm a agile coach, TDD coach, that sort of thing. It should have been Simon Reekie here, so apologies for that. Apologies that you've got to see me again. I did say when we started XPMan I didn't want it to be the Rutherford show, so yeah, apologies for that. I've had about an hour to prepare this I look at Simon's slides. You don't want to see him. So I've made some notes. Apologies for if I just keep going back to this. I'm not here to diss Cucumber. I'm here to diss Cucumber and SpecFlow. So I'm going to do this as a fugue in 3 parts. Firstly, I want to talk about Gherkin, which is the language in which you write Cucumber and SpecFlow specs, the given, when, then, feature, scenario, background thing, the language. So the selling point of it is it's supposed to be natural language. So that's supposed to be attractive to them people in the business who don't want to do programmy stuff. But also, we're told if you're going to be good at cuking, you need to develop a strong domain language between the developers and the other 2 amigos, whoever they are. And that feels contradictory to me. On the one hand, it's supposed to be natural language. On the other hand, we're aiming for this kind of precision, this sort of accurate terminology. If you don't achieve that, the cukes end up being rambling documentation at best, full of duplication, ambiguity, and so on. So no better than most of the functional specs that we used to have in the good old days. So this idea that it's both natural and domain specific means it can never be precise. But that's what you want your tests to be, right? You want your tests to actually define the behavior of the system, of the application you're testing. As a language, Gherkin, well, it's not. It's lame. Remember in the 90s, those 4th generation languages, you could use them to program for the one specific problem that they were designed to solve, but you couldn't do much else with them. Anybody use Salesforce at the moment? It's that sort of thing. They look nice, but they're next to useless. And because of that, there are very few decent tools around to help you manage them. It's all very well saying that there's great support in Visual Studio for SpecFlow, but there isn't actually refactoring support for the Gherkin side of things. There's nothing that can tell you, hey, you're using the word house to mean 2 different things here. Yeah, so because they're intended to be natural language, therefore by definition, they're going to be difficult to maintain and refactor, and they're going to end up full of duplication, riddled with connasance, and yes, got it in. So it's a second-rate language for specifying things from that point of view. Almost as bad a problem with it is, first time you see it, you think, given, when, then. Wow, that's nice and clear. Why did nobody tell me about this before? It's so obvious. I set something up, I do an action, and then I check the consequences. I do this, then I do this, then I do this. It's imperative. By definition, it's imperative. It encourages you to write step-by-step descriptions of how you interact with the thing you're testing. And again, explicitly in the Cucumber documentation, they tell you not to do that. They tell you not to go into implementation details or details of the user interface or all that sort of stuff. And yet, the language that they've given you forces you to do that. Every other programming language, even C, allows me to write functional code if I try hard enough. But Gherkin doesn't. It forces me to be imperative. It forces the step by step approach to things. And that, by its nature, is going to make people who write Gherkin scenarios think imperatively. And once you start doing that, you bring in details. It's really easy to get sucked into, I navigate to this page, then I click this button, and then I see this. Detail that you really don't want in a supposedly abstract specification of your system. Once you've got that, you've got a living document that's full of implementation details. And the cost of ownership of that is massive, because you can't change anything about the user interface without incurring the cost of having to rewrite dozens of Qs. So one of the founders of Cucumber Pro, Matt Nguyen, I worked on a project with him for 3 years. Needless to say, there were a lot of Qs involved. And within a year, they had to be deleted because whatever you changed broke something, broke some of the Qs. Not because we were changing the business requirements, but because it's really hard to keep them separated from the details of how the user interacts with the thing you're testing. And that's because given, when, then. Do this, do that, do the next thing. Imperative rather than declarative. If you can write a declarative description when I'm navigating to the home page, premium users get the private page, unregistered users get the public page. Declarative stuff, much less likely to break. But we haven't got any tools that do that. You have to build that sort of stuff yourself. If you're going to do that, you may as well use a programming language and use a unit testing tool, which actually gives you all of the tools and features support that you need. So that's the language. Gherkin language, not. So the tools, obviously the main two are Cucumber and SpecFlow. Before Matt Nguyen joined the project that I was on, he worked at a startup in London, which is still going, but they deleted all their Qs as well because it was just like wading through treacle. The cost of ownership was just massive. So Gherkin gives you this concept of we'll write steps in natural language, and then we'll have some code behind that translates those to the codey stuff, so act as a bridge between the English and the actual. So that's an extra set of code that you didn't have to write before, that's not the tests, it's not your application, it's something in between. It's yet an extra place where you can get stuff wrong. These step definitions proliferate like crazy. If you change your terminology in the Englishy bit, very often you're going to orphan some of your step definitions. And there's very little tool support that helps you find those orphans, so they just proliferate. And then they've got to keep compiling. So the cost of ownership of your step definitions is much higher than it needs to be as well. You've got this extra layer of stuff between the tests, which are written in natural language, and your application. Who needs that? The raison d'etre for this is that you can write a natural language thing and then an implementation that the business person doesn't see. And that separates the two things. That separates the what from the how. The what I want to do from the how I'm actually going to get the application to do that. We've already got a thing for separating the what from the how. It's called functions. They have a name and they have a body, and they do exactly that job. So these tools, Cucumber, SpecFlow, etc., are reinventing that wheel, but without any of the tool support that we've had building up for 50 years that allow us to work with functions. You know, we can refactor, we can compose functions, we can build higher order functions, we can do all sorts of stuff. You can't do any of that with Gherkin. You can't do any of that with step definition or these so-called tools. All you've got is natural language and step definition. Why reinvent the wheel? We've got functions. You can use those to help you write unit tests or tests using a unit test framework and make those tests readable. And if you do that, you're using a proper programming language, and you've got all the tool support you need to help you do that. So this leads to poor code quality in the step definitions as well, because they're in no man's land between the Englishy stuff and your application. Generally, I find that the code quality in this middle layer is atrocious. There's no tool support, there's no patterns to help you write them well. There's one or two now, pages, page builders, that sort of thing, but not a lot. The code quality in there is terrible. Worse than you would find in using a unit test framework to express the same tests, because people are gradually starting to think of unit tests as actual code and starting to refactor it, which is good. So the Gherkin and the step definitions together are harder to write than actual code. They end up being maintained by programmers. Why? Why incur that huge cost? So part 3, culture.
2 minutes.
I'm going to use those 2 minutes.
It's okay, you've got another 2 months to use as well.
First of all, Cucumber tests are really hard to keep green. They tend to rely on user-facing aspects of the application that change quite rapidly. And if they don't, then the step definitions are going to be hard to maintain because they're effectively creating a new user interface specifically for the tests. So trying to keep your cubes green is really costly. And I've certainly been on projects where, out of 5 people, one of them was full time keeping the cubes green. Crazy. So there's a huge investment. Even if you do get buy-in from the non-programmer folks that this is a good idea, and I've very rarely seen that happen. Only once or twice have I seen that in the last 10 years or so. Most of the time the business people think, they're not used to thinking imperatively, do this, then do that, then do the other thing. They're more interested in thinking in terms of business features. When the user buys 5 things, we'll apply a discount. That's all they care about. All this imperative stuff is our way of dealing with that, not theirs. So they don't get engaged most of the time, which means these are maintained by developers. So just use a unit testing tool. Done.
Okay, we have 5 minutes to directly review others' arguments, if you would like to use them. Who wants to go first? Others first?
Let's take it in turns. Your turn.
Sounds good.
So again, I was just taking notes on my phone there, so apologies for looking down here. But just as Kevin was going through his arguments there, I just took a couple of points down that I'd like to discuss. So you mentioned the feature files getting polluted with implementation details. Potentially, is that something that could be avoided though by pushing those implementation details down into the code behind? One of the things that I've really enjoyed about Cucumber is forms is one of my favourite things that I've dealt with our business units. So they say, I want the form to work properly. What does work properly mean? What fields are filled in? Can this date field take a string? Who knows? But Cucumber made those conversations happen. So in our feature files, we do have the form is filled in correctly. Because I agree, that's all they want to know about. But we've had that conversation, so I understand what filled in correctly means. So in our code behind, I know the form is filled in correctly. Another point you touched on was it takes a lot of effort and manpower to keep these Cucumber tests green, and I do agree with that. But again, it's not the way you implement it. So taking unit testing as an example. I've seen a lot of places, I've been guilty of it myself definitely, where I would unit test every single class. Brilliant. I know my code is fantastic. It all works perfectly. I need to refactor something. I've broken 20 different tests. But in reality, that unit test didn't reflect the unit of work. I was testing the class. So depending on your approach to unit testing, refactoring can be very hard. You raised a really good point about why don't you just use a unit testing framework? And to be honest, I would sort of agree with you there. If you can use a normal unit testing framework and you can make those unit tests readable, accessible, if a business user wants to come and speak to you and say, give me confidence that this is going to work, yeah, use your unit test. That's brilliant. Don't have this extra layer of nonsense that you as a developer don't need, but they do need. So if you can do that, that's brilliant. But a lot of people like myself, Cucumber just makes that really, really easy to do.
2 minutes.
I'll leave it. I always leave 2 minutes. So you say Cucumber tests are taking up a lot of overhead that you don't need. You say people are getting a lot better at unit testing these days. You know, unit testing is becoming second nature to all of us. That is how you write code. But when unit tests were first introduced, I'm sure not everyone was as good as them as they are now. So I think if we sort of stick at this, including the business into how we work, you know, maybe years, hopefully shorter, that'll be second nature of how we work. You know, we're just another part of the team that everyone needs to get involved with. And I guess I'd just like to finish then on a really interesting point that Uncle Bob says. So, rushing never makes you go faster, even in the short term. So if you think you're binning off something that you don't need so you can get a feature out quicker, in the long term and the short term, you're probably going to go slower. There's something will go wrong, you have to go find that out. The business user will say, prove this to me, and you won't have it. And that's my rebuttal.
Dr. Kevin Rutherford is a software development coach, trainer, and extreme programmer. He is the creator of the vastly underrated Greek code smell detector and the vastly overrated book, Refactoring in Ruby. If you have ever used the Unix system Vi or transferred money between bank accounts, you will literally use this code. He was using Vi before you were born. Kevin, you've got 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, so good points all. I think, okay, so I wasn't comparing cucumbering to unit testing. What I was comparing was Cucumber and SpecFlow to unit testing tools. So I'm suggesting that you can still write acceptance tests, but if you use a unit testing tool, you've got more control, more flexibility at your disposal. I'm not saying don't use acceptance tests, just use unit testing. What I'm saying is we've got really good tools for writing tests, and so don't use these shit ones. At the beginning of your talk, you said, here's Mr. Client, who actually looked like a developer to me. So a perfect person to be writing cucumber tests. You said the client talks in riddles, and Cucumber solves that. No tool solves that. Only conversations, feedback loops solve that sort of thing. You don't need Cucumber and SpecFlow to have those conversations. BDD is not about Cucumber. I'm sick and tired of the number of teams I've met who say, we're writing BDD tests. What? You're doing BDD or you're writing tests. You might write tests in response to a BDD exercise, but there's no such thing as BDD tests. Behavior-driven development is a way of managing the conversations that have to happen. Cucumber is a way of capturing those conversations and throwing your plans down the toilet. Your codebreaker example tests had implementation details in them. So if any change happens to the messages that appear on screen, those are going to start being hard to maintain. They could have been pushed down using better abstractions. And if you'd written those tests using RSpec or something like that, you'd have much better tools for doing that, like calling functions with meaningful names, and so on and so on. So it's really easy to get into that trap. They were very, very imperative. Do this, then do that, then do that, then do that, then do that, rather than declarative, which leads to a better understanding of what the business is trying to achieve. The phone's gone off. Hang on. Don't panic. Yeah, the thing about rushing, I treat everything that Uncle Bob says with the disdain it deserves. He's done nothing but harm to our industry. He's not originated a single concept. He collects other people's concepts and shits on them. If he's worried about people rushing, the last thing they should be doing is creating a set of Gherkin tests that need 5 times the maintenance of tests written in an actual programming language. I'll stop at that point. I'm gonna give you back one of your minutes.
Thank you very much. We have a single question which hasn't passed through the moderator filter, I'm afraid. So I'm just going to have faith in you to have sensible questions. Martin, Kevin, would you like to go back to the front, please? And any questions from the audience?
One of the pros that was mentioned about Cucumber was that you can have QAs write tests, it's natural language. And I see the whole thing. I joined the company and found out about Cucumber, like, wow, you can do natural language, give them when then. Let's introduce this with the code base of crap. And started putting in steps that said, this is what it means when someone types, when I click this button or when I do this. Gave it to QAs and said, you can just write natural language now. And they did. And of course it didn't fit in with any of the steps I've written because they used a slightly different word or they changed the phrasing slightly, or I'd written the steps so that we could find a button with this text on it. And actually, you didn't really have that text, or there were multiple buttons with that text. So came down to, I was spending all my time saying, I know I've told you it's natural language, but really you just need to write kind of English in code. Shouldn't I just have taught them to write certain unit tests, or should we just hire QAs to write code anyway, if that's the character we're looking for?
Ideal world?
Martin, 90 seconds to reply.
Absolutely. Minus a couple. Ideal world? Yeah, I massively agree. I don't know if you've ever tried to teach QA project manager to write a unit test. Doesn't end well. It's a non-starter. I think the word natural language is probably not the greatest word to use with all this. I think understandable is probably the right word to use. Yeah, you can't just write any old sentence. But you said at the start of that, I told them, go do this. I think that's probably the point of Cucumber. You can't just say, go do this. Yeah, and I'm over-exaggerating, obviously, but it's the conversation style. You said I had to sit down with them. That sounds like a really good thing to me. That sounds like Cucumber sort of worked. Because you had to sit with them and...
Would it not save time if I'd written a bunch of unit tests that had sensible names, saying, given I do this, or whatever phrase I chose, and just gave me a list, and we could have a chat about that? I wouldn't have to maintain the test that they tried to write. I would have written my unit tests, and they would run. I'd have confidence. I could prove to all the product managers and everyone that it runs. QAs could do their roles.
I think potentially Cucumber could have got involved earlier, it sounds like that, because how would you have written those unit tests? Those conversations should have already been happening before it came to you. You should have been involved, well, ideally, but you should have at least received good quality acceptance criteria in this language already. So potentially move it up through the chain. And then that could make the whole process work a little bit easier, rather than
10 seconds.
I've done my work, here you go, QA, bring it to the front.
Okay. I kind of should treat that as two questions to give you an extra 30 seconds. Kevin, would you like to respond to any of those points?
Well, I'm just wondering who thinks that using Cucumber is a substitute for actually having the user use and explore what you've developed? Anybody? It can never be a replacement for feedback loops. And the feedback loops are what drive the process. The conversations have to happen. And if you can shorten the time between the conversation and the user using your response to that conversation, if you can get that time as short as possible, why do you need anything else in between? I don't understand where the benefit of Cucumber comes as an extra cost in the middle. You have the conversation, you test drive an implementation, you show the user reacts to it, the user tells you another thing they want, the cycle continues. I don't understand why we need something else that is 5 times as hard to maintain as the tests we need to write anyway. And why we're attempting to write that in a language that allegedly is the language that we're having that conversation in anyway. It feels like it's almost doing the opposite of what it claims. It feels like it's almost a substitute for conversation.
Can we have a question for Kevin, please?
Yeah. Is Gherkin Cucumber hard because of the implementation then, or because of the concepts?
When you say Gherkin Cucumber,
So Gherkin is the language, Cucumber is the implementation,
Cucumber is an implementation, yes.
and Stepflow is another.
Yeah.
Is the issue with it that they're crappy tools, or that the language and the concept as a whole is crappy?
Maybe I didn't make myself clear in my original presentation. I hate them both. I think the language is a poor language. It's not expressive enough. It doesn't have enough higher order structures to allow you to create the structures that you need in order to be expressive. The tools contain redundancy, and yes, I appreciate that. Given another 10 years, people might have developed refactoring tools and patterns and so on that help us write step definitions and all of that sort of stuff. But A, we don't have them now, and B, we're building tools to help us cope with bad tools. Doesn't seem right. So I guess I'm saying that Gherkin breeds bad habits, and Cucumber, and to a slightly lesser extent SpecFlow, make us pay for those bad habits by giving us something that's really hard to maintain.
Martin?
I wouldn't necessarily say that tooling or the concept is bad. I would say they're both hard to do. In an ideal world, I massively agree. Everyone would be in the same room, everyone would be talking, there'd be small feedback loops, everyone would understand each other, everyone would be engaged and switched on. In my experience, that doesn't happen. So if you've just got even a concept, never mind the tooling, something that gets people, conversation starter, and at least a common way of talking, it gets that ball rolling. That's why I like it so much. It's the if you're not in the room, you can understand what happened in that room. Rather than a replacement for the conversation, I find it a recording of the conversation. That's why I like it.
Okay. This question 4. Martin, go for it.
I'm pretty new to the crash course today, but it sounds like size and complexity of the project would play a massive part on how useful people could be, and also how smart your client is really and how willing they are to actually work with you. Is there not some projects that you sort of like might be missed and you just think Cucumber isn't going to work for that?
The client, massively so. They do have to be engaged. There's no two ways about it. But if they're not going to be engaged with you on trying something that could improve the process, how are they going to be engaged in anything worthwhile anyway? Mm-hmm. You know, there is a lot of emphasis on the developer, not only to make these tests work on a code level, you have to show why this is good, why these conversations need to happen. I think it's too easy just to say, client's not bothered, client's not engaged. If they're not engaged, that's because you've not shown them why it would benefit them to be engaged. So yes, the client is a massive part of it. The size of the projects and complexity of the projects, potentially I think the more complex the project, the better this is really. So if you've got all this mud of requirements and this happens, if this happens, oh, but if I'm in this kind of user, this will happen, that's really hard to keep in someone's head. So if you've got it clear, understandable, and repeatable, I'd say that's the ideal time to use it, to be honest. But I would say, just keep in mind the testing pyramid. These, you should have a few of these. These are potentially just the happy path. This is what I want.
15 seconds.
So don't test everything to death. You'll die. There's way too much work to do. Just keep it simple, and I think it'll work very well.
Okay.
I agree completely with the first sentence you said, which is if the customer isn't engaged, then no amount of tooling is going to fix that. If the customer is engaged, you're having conversations with them, why do you need tools? Yeah, just write the tests in an actual programming language. So to me, Cucumber, Gherkin, SpecFlow just add to the cost. If you've got an engaged customer, you've got an engaged customer. End of.
We give you so much time back. How generous are you?
All right. Just one last thing then. I do know before I pick up the phone whether Cucumber will help with the project that I'm about to get offered.
Any questions for Kevin? And I can guess what the question would be. James.
Ow.
Do you need 20 seconds?
The answer is no.
I have a question, but more of a challenge for Kevin actually, which I think is thrown up quite a lot. So I came into this and wasn't actually like, quite a cucumber, I'm pretty much on the fence to see it work very well, I see it working badly, but same thing about unit testing. But I do feel that I've thrown out quite a few straw men, and also arguments that you could easily apply to just pretty much everything we do. It's all right, we'll test the bad state, then we've got bad unit tests. So, yeah, I'm just not sure whether you actually believe what you're saying, or whether you're just taking it because you've had to fill in tonight. So I'm just not 100% sure, because I'm not sure everything you're saying applies to cucumber specifically. I mean, a lot of it's also about just automated testing in general. It's very hard, and the higher up the stack and the end-to-end those tests you get, the more complicated.
So, absolutely, and I'm not comparing acceptance testing with unit testing. I'm explicitly not doing that. What I'm saying is Gherkin stroke cucumber is a bad tool to use because it adds so much cost. It's really difficult to write good code in cucumber spec definitions. It's really difficult to write good Gherkin that engages the business and is as unambiguous as they allegedly. Oh yes.
Yeah,
so why bother with the extra burden of having an extra tool that makes it even worse? We've already got tools that we're pretty bad at using. Why have an extra one? I suppose one of the main things I'm saying is I don't believe this message that business people read and sometimes help to write the Gherkin.
But previous to that kind of stuff, it was all use cases written by VAs and even more complex and obfuscated sort of thing, which was even harder to translate and even harder to have conversations around.
At least there wasn't this pretense and this extra level of maintenance to try and keep them passive.
But that's more like having functional acceptance tests in general rather than specifically cucumber.
Yes, and all I'm saying is Gherkin and cucumber are the worst imaginable tool for doing that with.
Martin?
Well, I'd agree, to be honest. Yeah, it is hard. I agree. It is a skill. Yeah, I've been doing cucumber for a few years now, and I'd still say I'm average at it at best. But I think if we keep working at it and potentially even contribute to the tooling, it will get better. But the one thing I would just say is don't focus too much on the tests. Yes, that's a massive part of it, but if you're working at it, that's the main thing for me. If you're trying to work with these BAs to get better requirements, to understand what's going on, then even if you never, to be honest, in our team, we get a lot of Gherkin language through in our requirements, but never see a line of code.
Yeah.
Never at all.
It's much nicer than having big enough use case documents that no one can even request.
Exactly, it goes end to end. The requirements come down to the project manager, and the project manager gives us
I've had
tools.
salespeople writing user stories and giving the Gherkin.
And you can understand it.
They
And
just can, because they can say, hey, how about this feature, rather than like the way to the use cases.
exactly. It's not about the code, it's about you understand it. If you understand what they want, it's one. It's as simple as that for me.
Any questions for Martin?
You basically said that you write in natural language and then that generates the unit test. When you go, as a developer, I don't want to mess around with natural languages. Can I change the unit test so that would go, generate the...
From an actual tooling perspective, I have never tried. In theory, yeah, you could write that. So it would be really, if you're speaking purely from a spectral perspective, in theory, yes, you could do it because you have your step definitions, you have a wiring book file, I can't remember what they call it exactly, so that feature file knows what step to use. So in theory, yes, you could do it. It would be an absolute nightmare to do. So I wouldn't advise it, basically, in the short term, but in theory, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, were you saying, can you generate unit tests from Gherkin?
No, the other way around. So, say somebody, a QA or a client, is written in Gherkin stuff or the natural language or step flows or whatever, and it's generated unit tests, yeah?
Yeah.
So as a developer, I don't want to use that natural language. I just want to make changes to the unit tests so that that can then go back to the natural language and the QAs can make changes to it. Do you know what I mean? So I just stay in my C# world and they can stay in their natural world.
If you were speaking purely on...
Martin? No.
Got it.
So you said in theory yes. I'm going to say in theory no. I don't think the state of AI is good enough to do that, and I'm not sure it ever would be, and I'm not sure why you would want that. I suppose one of the things I'm trying to say this evening is it's perfectly possible using JUnit, RSpec, etc. to write code that is readable by human beings. It's not easy. A lot of people are really bad at it, but it's perfectly possible because those are Turing-complete programming languages with lots of higher order capabilities for creating higher order abstractions and giving them names. So why you would ever want to do what you're suggesting, even if it were possible in some far-flung future, I'm not sure I would want that.
One final question for this part, please. Claire, ideally for Kevin.
Yeah, okay. I confess I've got to leave in a minute, so this is really more of a contribution than a question, but I'll just turn it into a question at the end. I've got a sort of confession to make. Kind of while Kevin was speaking, I came to a kind of personal realisation. When I came in the door, I put myself down as a pro Q. And the reason for that is that I once spent several months, my main job being to maintain Cucumber, Spectrum, Gherkin, a whole suite of acceptance tests. And I loved it. I really enjoyed myself and I have very fond memories of it. But it was a few years ago, and as Kevin was speaking, the things that he was saying, I was like, oh yeah, tick. Ah, yeah, tick. Ooh, okay, yeah, tick. So what happened was it was actually the job of the BAs to write the natural language specifications, acceptance criteria, and we had a lovely sequence of automation, and then that all got magically turned into code. And then it was my job to maintain that code. In fact, it wasn't even officially my job, it just became my job and I doing it so much. But the problem was that it became harder and harder to turn those acceptance criteria into code because the VAs kept using slightly different language. And I kept sitting down and having conversations with them and saying, look, please can you use this phrase here consistently? Because you thought you'd used it here and here, but unfortunately you used the capital letter there and you didn't use one there. Or you used the word in this sentence and you used the word the in this sentence. And that turned into two completely different functions behind the scenes. And I'm trying to make reusable code. And I enjoy that because I'm a bit anal. So that's why I enjoyed it. I quite enjoyed being responsible for taking the mess and making it neat. But it got harder and harder, and the reason it got harder and harder was because that natural language concept was an illusion. It felt like natural language, it looked like natural language, but actually the only way to maintain it and keep it useful was to have a dev's brain. was to have a really anal point of view and a really anal attitude where you look for consistency, you understand that words are important, capital letters are important, names are important, and you have to think very, very programmatically in order for it to work. So what you end up with is orphan tests, you end up with code that's rubbish, and it became a full-time job for me to maintain it and make it not be rubbish. Every time other people got involved, it got all rubbish again. And really, the only reason I enjoyed it was because I liked the fact that it was my job to make it neat and nice. So the question is, do you think that maybe, actually, because I'm sure I'm not the only dev in the world that has that tendency, that quite enjoys spending ages tinkering with things and reorganising things and tidying things up and removing duplication and making things neat, that actually we can be fooling ourselves that this is this amazing communication tool, when really it's just an excuse for us to hide in the corner and write more code.
And if you've got those tendencies, why not put them to use refactoring tests written using a fully fledged testing framework like RSpec or JUnit? Steve Freeman talks about one of the last times that we tried to involve non-technical people in writing code, and that was COBOL, and look how that turned out. You're absolutely right. In order to get the non-technical people to use precise enough language so that the Gherkin maps onto a finite set of step definitions, the Gherkin then has to become unnatural. So you're losing the benefits, the so-called benefits of having that extra layer. So it feels like waste. And your entire job wouldn't have existed if I did it my way.
Martin?
From what it sounds like you're describing your problem to be, your problem didn't sound like it was with Cucumber. It sounded like it was with programming in general. So you start new projects, everything's brilliant. This is fantastic. I'm 100% dry. My solid principles are spot on. 6 months down the line, can you still say that? Can you still say, I have no duplication. Everything is a single responsibility. Software gets harder the older it is. It sounds like that the same rule of software happens with your tests. You've got to stay on top of it. If you sort of let that rock seep in, it'll get harder and harder and harder over time. And I definitely agree that is true for Cucumber, but no more so than any other code you write, I would say.
Give it a few more years and Uncle Bob will come up with something equivalent to solid.
I'm a big Bob fan, what can I say?
Okay, thank you very much for our participants.